Hi, everyone. This is Alex Epstein, host of Power Hour. And this week we have another Best of Power Hour while I work on The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels 2.0. By the way, speaking of that book, you can now get it on Amazon.com. Just search for The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, and it'll say The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, I believe, revised and expanded. 2.0 is sort of my insider name for it. I'm probably not going to publicly call it 2.0 just because I want to introduce it to a lot of people who don't know about version 1. But for those of you who've heard this show or listened to this show, you're probably familiar with version 1. So version 2 is very different, and I expect to be much improved. This week's episode is featuring Robert Zubrin. We did 2 episodes with him. This is the first one, and it's on his book, Merchants of Despair. The subtitle is Radical Environmentalists, Criminal Pseudoscientists, and the Fatal Cult of Anti-Humanism. Now, this is a book that I found very valuable, and it's one thing I like a lot about Zubrin is he's very pro-human. He's unusually pro-human in terms of just his philosophy of the earth. And one place this came out recently, is he has a new book called The Case for Space, and I've only read the part of it where he deals with rising CO2 levels, but he deals with that issue in a very, very pro-human and interesting way, and he has a really interesting idea, particularly about what can be done with the oceans to make them much, much more fertile. So I'd actually just recommend getting that book just for that section. It's called Engineering the Earth. And in this episode, Merchants of Despair, Robert Zubrin talks about what he calls anti-humanism and the history of it, the theory of it, the practice of it. And that's a theme very near and dear to my heart because I think that so much bad in the world is caused by ideas that human beings are intrinsically bad, that we're intrinsically destructive, and that we should not value ourselves above other species. And so this is a very valuable interview, and I hope you enjoy it. Okay, well, next week we'll be back with another Best of Power Hour. Enjoy this week's episode.
Power Hour. Coal. Oil. Natural gas. Power Hour, the show where today's top energy experts break down today's top energy issues. No sound bites, no talking points, no nonsense, no BS, no softball questions, no vagueness, just in-depth analysis and ruthless clarity. Power Hour. Here's your host, Alex Epstein.
Welcome to Power Hour. I'm your host, Alex Epstein. Now, there's a saying that those who don't know the lessons of history are doomed to repeat it. This is a very popular saying, to the point of being a cliche, but it's a very true and profound saying. Unfortunately, I don't think this is an idea that we pay nearly enough attention to. For example, I think one lesson of history that is widely ignored is that it is very common for societies of seemingly good people to embrace extremely destructive movements. Take Germany in the 20th century. This was a place that was called the land of poets and philosophers. It was the most intellectually respected nation in the world. American universities encouraged their scholars to go over to Germany to learn from the best and brightest. And yet, in the 20th century, it committed some of the most barbaric atrocities in human history. Or even look at the United States. It's little known that in the United States, Nazism and some of the ideas behind it, such as superiority of some races to another, the idea that we should breed and genetically engineer the right kind of population, the government should collectively do that. The idea that the Nazis also had about overpopulation, all of these kinds of ideas led Nazism to have quite a bit of support in the United States. Now, going beyond that, the most murderous movement of the 20th century, the communist movement, was even much more widely supported in the United States. Communism was outright fashionable in popular culture for many decades in this country. And what I think this shows is that The fact that an ideology or movement is widely accepted and that the people who accept it are in many ways nice people does not mean it's safe. And that means that we always have to be on the lookout for what is the real nature of the movements that we are exposed to, the ideas that are exposed to. When we're taught that something is good and we see that something is popular, something like, say, the movement to go green, we can't just accept that this is good. We really have to think about it uh, critically. And as we've discussed on this show, I believe, and many of our guests believe, that the so called green movement is incredibly dangerous to our way of life. It, in practice, opposes every form of practical energy, coal, oil, natural gas, nuclear, or hydro, and is therefore a threat to modern life and to progress. And as much as we've talked about this, and I think we've made this point pretty well, it's still, I think, in people's mind on a pretty abstract level. It doesn't seem real that something could actually go really wrong, or even that things really are going wrong, that there are millions of people around the world who are dying premature deaths because of green ideas, and that in America, many of us are unnecessarily impoverished because of green ideas. And in that vein, I think you owe it to yourself to read the amazing new book, Merchants of Despair by Robert Zubrin, which is about the ideas and consequences of the green movement today, but also about the ideas and consequences of the related movements of the past for eugenics and population control, which go back hundreds of years. The history in this book, particularly the history of how these movements, like today's green movement, were regarded as scientific, were supported by consensuses, alleged consensuses of scientists, were supported by a government scientific establishment. These movements took actions that prematurely ended millions of lives. And from energy to biotechnology, Zubrin illustrates the green movement is doing the same today. Now, I started reading this book 2 weeks ago, and I've since read it all cover to cover twice. And my Kindle is basically just one giant highlight because it's got so many great quotes from history in it, as well as analysis from the author. And I've been plugging this like crazy on Facebook and Twitter, not knowing that happily the author, Robert Zubrin, would agree to be on this show. So I'm super excited that our guest today is Robert Zubrin, and we're going to get to talk all about this book, all the important history and ideas that are in it. Now, Robert Zubrin is the president of Pioneer Astronautics, an aerospace engineering R&D firm. He leads the Mars Society, an international organization dedicated to furthering space exploration. For many years, he worked as a senior engineer for Lockheed Martin. His doctorate is in nuclear engineering, and he has an extensive scientific background, and many other qualifications. That's his official bio. Unofficially, what strikes me about Dr. Zubrin is that he combines an intense enthusiasm for science and technology with a deep interest in the history of the philosophy of the things that oppose science and technology. As he'll talk about in his own experiences working to promote science and technology, he ran against this opposition that didn't make any sense to him. And in a very admirable way, he went about trying to understand it. And the result is this book. I hope you agree that this makes for a very interesting interview. And find out, stick around. We'll be back on the other side with Dr. Robert Zubrin. Oh, wait, one more thing. Stay tuned at the end of the show because I have a special announcement at the end about the future of Power Hour that you will not want to miss. Stay tuned and we'll see you on the other side.
Power Hour. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of energy. Power Hour. The antidote to shallow thinking about energy issues.
Hi, we're joined now by Dr. Robert Zubrin, author of Merchants of Despair, Radical Environmentalists, Criminal Pseudoscientists, and the Fatal Cult of Anti-Humanism. Robert, welcome to Power Hour.
Thanks for inviting me.
My pleasure. As anyone who follows my Facebook page knows, I've been plugging this book all week, actually before I knew I could get you on the show, although that was certainly a hope. I've actually read it twice in the last week, which is pretty rare for me. And I found it fascinating in many ways. And one is that it's an extremely philosophical book, and it draws very deep and disturbing similarities between the eugenics movement, which is now widely viewed as evil, the population control movement, which is mostly viewed as evil, and then the green or environmentalist movement, which is widely believed to be good, or at least benign. So it's a very philosophical book, and we'll get into the parallels. But I'm just curious, Robert, you're primarily a scientist. How did you come to these sort of very deep philosophical conclusions about one of the most powerful movements in our culture?
Well, by coming up against it, I'm an engineer, actually, originally a nuclear engineer, and going back 3 decades, you know, running into a brick wall with the environmentalists blocking nuclear power, which was just amazing to me, given that here we had this vast source of uh, extremely clean energy, the thing that answered all their concerns about pollution and resource limits, and they wanted to stop it. And uh, and then as the years went by, I saw people with other technologies that would be breakthroughs for humanity, genetically modified foods, for example, that could end all kinds of malnutrition across the world, also being blocked by these people. These people say they're against spraying pesticides. The people invented genetically modified crops that had their own pesticides. You didn't need to spray them. That didn't that could fix their own nitrates. You didn't need to spread fertilizer that they were allegedly all concerned about, and so forth. In every area, they would block all solutions to the problems that they were claiming they were concerned about. So, in fact, uh, apparently for them, the point was not the solution, the point was promoting the problem. Uh, and I read a lot of history, and as I did, I saw that there were parallels to earlier uh, movements uh, which also strove to stop humanity from shaking off its chains, and and not only parallels but common ideological axioms. And then it became very clear to me that what we were dealing with were not separate eugenic movements and population control movements and environmental movements and anti-technology movements, but we were dealing with one movement, which is an anti-human movement.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I just have to say it's really refreshing because I mean my background is in philosophy, and one frustrating thing about dealing with people in the hard sciences is they're often not very interested in either political issues or the ideas, and certainly not the history uh, behind political issues. So it's just so great that this book exists. Now, one thing I really enjoyed about the book, and that isn't exactly captured in the title, which is understandably a negative title since it's about a negative movement, is your own enthusiasm for technology in particular, but more broadly, just the amazing impact technology, which and technology is really, using human ingenuity to change the planet for the better, for the better for humans. It's just yeah, what's striking to me is the history you tell about how in the very areas technology is opposed, namely population, race relations, and environment, technology actually has made what has and was making those things dramatically better. Can you talk a bit about that?
Well, uh, you know, the the problem with the anti-human movements is that it basically postulates that there's only so much to go around, and so the more people you have, the less resources there will be for everyone. But it's just the opposite. The more people you have, the more resources there are for everyone because people are resourceful, which means full of resources. In fact, it is people that create resources. Okay, Malthus said population is going to outrun food supply, but the population is what creates the food supply. And even in Malthus's time, agriculture was so much more advanced than it had been in ancient times, which in turn was far more advanced than what hunters or gatherers could do. Uh, and in the time since Malthus, the world population has multiplied sevenfold, and people on average are eating much better than they were then. When Paul Ehrlich wrote his book in 1968, The Population Bomb, in which he predicted that the world population would double by the year 2000 and everyone would be starving unless massive forced population control measures were taken. Well, in fact, massive forced population control measures were taken partially at his urging, and the world population doubled anyway by the year 2010. But yet, people are not starving. People are eating much better today than they were in 1968. And not only that, much more of them have cars and color TVs and all kinds of things that people didn't even think about in 1968. iPods and iPads and and all the internets and all this stuff, so that we have the ability to communicate across the world. People create resources. There would be no oil. There was no oil until 1859 when Colonel Drake invented oil drilling technology. There was no nuclear fuel until we invented nuclear power. You name it. There was no aluminum. Aluminum, the second most common metal used in our industrial society, was unknown to humanity until the early 1800s. People looked at things that contained aluminum and called them dirt. And yet we found it, we created it, and now we have unlimited supplies of this ultralight, very strong metal. We create our resources, and the more of us there are, the more resources we're going to create.
And one thing that's striking about that you mentioned with Malthus is the issue that during his time, there was evidence that this, as Julian Simon would put it, this ultimate resource phenomenon was going on, that the human mind is the ultimate resource and that it turns raw materials into things that provide us services, i.e. resources. And yet Malthus and others ignored this evidence and ignored the fact that, as you point out, the past progress completely refuted his kind of pseudo-mathematical prediction, and yet they evaded that. And I think that points to one of my favorite formulations in the book, where you describe the underlying idea and you say, quote, "Its fundamental thesis that human beings are pathogens whose activities need to be suppressed in order to protect a fixed ecological order with interests that stand above those of humanity." Could you elaborate on this basic idea of theirs?
Yeah, basically, what they say is humans are vermin. They're out of control, and so they need to be put under control, which means someone's got to be in control. So fundamentally, it's an argument for tyranny and ultimately genocide. And this is why it has always been appealing to would-be tyrants or for those who wish to justify oppressive regimes. This is its charm. This is why it's been promoted from on high. This is why it's made fashionable again and again, despite the fact that it has no scientific validity.
It seems in particular the idea of a fixed ecological order is at least to me, that seems like a real uniter among the three. I've heard other interviews with you where certain hosts, I mean, you can imagine anyone who sort of allies themselves with the environmentalist movement is going to be hostile to your thesis. Although I think if they read the book, it's really compelling, the evidence that's presented. But one thing that struck me is if you look at all three of these movements, there's this idea of we're somehow going against nature and that's bad. So in population control, we're unnaturally overpopulating the earth. With the whole eugenics thing, it was that allegedly we were unnaturally spreading inferior genes around the earth. And with environmentalism, it's that we're unnaturally transforming the earth. Do you see that strain among all of them?
Yeah, sure. But this term unnatural is a verbal sleight of hand, because on the one hand, the word nature, it has a certain positive feel to it. You look at nature, you look at beautiful scenery and trees and birds and butterflies, and that, well, nature is good. Okay, but nature is also uncivilized, wild, hostile. Okay, that people had to make their way in nature. If you really try to survive in the state of nature, it's very hard and very brutal. It's a very savage situation. And the creation of civilization is an enormous achievement. The replacement of, and not just the replacement of certain forests with orchards that are filled with trees bearing fruit, and prairies with farms that are producing food that can feed multitudes, but it's those things that allow us to create cities in which first thousands, then hundreds of thousands, and now millions of people can come together, exchange ideas, and develop culture. So it is this battle against savagery that represents the progress of human civilization. Instead of celebrating Earth Day, this week ago, we should have been celebrating Civilization Day, because this is humanity's great achievement.
And it's very telling how as you put it, the anti-humanist view is exactly the opposite. That is, you make the point that there are all these wonderful parts of nature that we enjoy, and yet their conception of nature is not for us to enjoy nature and to improve upon nature and to protect ourselves from it. It's that they oppose every aspect of nature that is touched by human beings. So if there are more of us, then they're against it. If we build shopping malls, they're against it. If we split the atom, they're against it. So it's the only part of nature they're against is human nature.
Yeah, and if you view nature in its entirety, obviously it includes the development of humans and human society. No, what they support is the wild, the brutal side of nature, because the whole point, this isn't about trees. Okay, this is about power. This isn't about weather. This is about power. This is about justifying tyranny. That is the purpose of this theory. That is the need that it meets. That is its market. That's who it's been sold to, and that's who, therefore, wishes to promote it.
So, I want to ask more about that, because if you look at any tyrannical movement, you obviously always have the people who have an incentive, where if any movement says there's this problem, we need a higher authority to solve it. Obviously, whoever is in the position of the higher authority, they have a certain incentive. But then there's also the issue of why is there a mass support of it? What is it, just that they're being maleducated, or is there a certain need of theirs that's being met by, say, the green movement today? I mean, if you look at people engaging in like very superficial things like recycling that's inefficient, and the whole obsession with that, there's something that's going on that's not just power.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's power, and then it is, how the stuff gets promoted to people, because people have their bad side, and those with a certain modicum of power are not above using it to those that they can put their boots down on. And so, I mean, for example, population control is a justification for racism. And I mean, you can see this. Let me read you a little section from Paul Ehrlich's book, The Population Bomb. Okay. And you can see that underlying all the pseudoscience, and we can discuss why it is completely pseudoscience, scientific fraud, in a minute. But I want to get to the gut feeling that's underneath it, okay? And Ehrlich reveals it, okay? Paul Ehrlich, the author. He says, I have understood the population explosion intellectually for a long time. I came to understand it emotionally one stinking hot night in Delhi a few years ago. My wife and daughter and I were returning to our hotel in an ancient taxi. As we crawled through the city, we entered a crowded slum area. The temperature was well over 100. The air was a haze of dust and smoke. The streets seemed alive with people, people eating, people washing, people sleeping, people visiting, arguing and screaming, people thrusting their hands through the taxi window, begging, people defecating and urinating, people clinging to buses, people hurting animals, people. As we moved slowly through the mob, hand horns squawking, the dust, noise, heat, and cooking fires gave the scene a hellish aspect. Would we ever get to our hotel? I mean, the racism in here is visceral. And he says it himself. I understood it, okay, the population explosion emotionally, okay? This is the emotion that's at the basis of it. It's hatred of...
I'm sorry, hatred of what?
Of other races. It's racism, simply. I mean, that's the only way you can describe this. I mean, you read this paragraph. It's awful.
I I found that paragraph very interesting, and I mean, I could tell that it was something that of all the horrible things Paul Ehrlich says that you quote him saying, I mean that even was one of your least favorite. I
But
take
it's
from
the
that
most
those
healing. It's where he's finally getting down to why he's putting out
well
all this stuff.
well,
He
but I think
wants to get rid of these people. He doesn't like them.
well, yeah, so the people I think is very revealing. But there's something about, so part of the, I think in my mind, it's, I have a slightly different interpretation in that if you look at, say, the conditions in India that he is pointing to, those are not conditions that we would want to live under, and those conditions are objectively inferior to, say, the conditions in the United States at the time. But the problem with Ehrlich is he sees something like this, and he sees it as human beings can't solve this problem. This is inevitable when we just do, when we're free, when we're left free, as if India was a free place. Instead of recognizing the power of human freedom and the human mind to alleviate problems, as occurred when, as you talk about, India's agriculture multiplied dramatically, the standard of living went up, it became a freer country. His default viewpoint is the mind is inefficacious, and so we need to get rid of these people, and we shouldn't even give them the chance. And I think that's, so I wouldn't call it primarily racism. It's contempt for the mind, and that seems to run across contempt for the mind and just contempt for the sanctity of the individual. It doesn't strike me as racist. It strikes me as those.
Well, he says, India is one country you must let go down the drain. You know, he says it's going to be brutal. I mean, there's all this stuff here. It's like harden my heart. It's really very much like the Nazi stuff, where they would totally brutalize various populations, Jews, Slavs. They'd reduce them to dirt-ridden skeletons, and then people would just look at them and say, oh, well, it'd be a mercy just to gas them, clean them off the surface of the earth. And that's how this is. And you can say that by comparison with the Nazis, he himself did not reduce them to this plight, as opposed to they who did to their victims. But nevertheless, his final solution was the same.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I mean, I regard Paul Ehrlich as evil for this, and many other reasons, and certainly the things he advocates today in terms of, quote, solutions to catastrophic global warming would have a massive death toll as well. And as we're talking about Ehrlich, that connects to another point in the book that I found really enlightening, which is, Ehrlich is a, quote, scientist. I mean, he's a butterfly doctor, so he's not exactly, but he became this famous ecologist. But throughout these three movements, the eugenics movement, the population movement, the environmental movement, one thing that you point out, and that's particularly bloody and brutal with the first two, and hopefully we'll minimize it with the last, is how these movements use this combination of like a government establishment of science to oppress people, and how the name and mantle of science leads to this incredible compliance and indifference by population to genocide.
Right. I mean, as Rudolf Hess, the number 2 Nazi, said, National Socialism is simply applied biology. Okay? This is science. If you don't accept it, you're simply being irrational. This is the inconvenient truth. Okay? The inconvenient truth. The human race progresses by getting rid of inferior races. The inconvenient truth. The inconvenient truth that there's too many people in the world, that there's just not enough to go around, that some people are just going to have to starve, that that's just how it is, that there is no alternative to simply getting rid of these excess people. The inconvenient truth that it is impossible, allegedly, for the third world to develop and enjoy the same kind of standard of living that we in the United States and Europeans have, because they would have too many carbon emissions. And you may want them to have a decent life, but it's just not possible. So harden your heart and accept the inconvenient truth. That's where they stand. That's what they always say.
I found the Nazi example, the Nazi example, I should say, in connection with the American support of the Nazis and the whole eugenics councils, to be just almost unbearable to read. But I think listeners need to hear about it. Could you tell us about just how closely allied many prominent Americans were with the ideas and the practices that led to the extermination of, 10 million people by Hitler?
Sure. Uh, in the 1920s and 30s, there was in this country a large movement called the eugenics movement, which was well funded out of very respectable circles in the social register, the Harrimans, the Osborns, which is a branch of the Morgan family, and others later, the Rockefellers. Um, they held many eugenics conferences here. They passed laws. Actually, they wrote the sterilization laws for invalids and deaf people and blind people and paupers, which were enacted in about 20 states and then became the model for the Nazi eugenics sterilization laws. They did a number of other things, um, including prevent measures for wiping out pellagra, which is a vitamin deficiency disease affecting the poor, whites, and the blacks in the American South. But they really focused very heavily on immigration. One of the great leaders of this movement was a man named Madison Grant. Um, he wrote the book, The Passing of the Great Race. I'll just read you a section of it. He says, in the city of New York and elsewhere in the United States, there is a Native American aristocracy resting upon layer after layer of immigrants of lower races. It has taken us 50 years to learn that speaking English, wearing good clothes, and going to school and to church does not transform a Negro into a white man. Americans will have a similar experience with the Polish Jew, whose dwarf stature, peculiar mentality, and ruthless concentration on self-interest are being engrafted upon the stock of the nation. Indiscriminate efforts to preserve babies among the lower classes often results in serious injury to the race. The laws of nature require the obliteration of the unfit, and human life is valuable only when it is of use to the community or race. This is straight Nazism. And this book, which was a bestseller here, became a runaway bestseller in Nazi Germany. Millions of copies were sold. It was one of Hitler's favorite books. Um, the and this typifies the views of the American eugenics movement. Another great leader of it was Henry Fairfield Osborn, president of the American Museum of Natural History. And and by the way, they were also founders of the environmental movement. There is a plaque today in the Redwood Forest in California today to Madison Grant and Henry Fairfield Osborn for their work in creating the Save the Redwoods League. But what they also didn't want to save were Jews fleeing Nazi Germany. And they pushed through laws that basically banned immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. The immigration laws passed in the 20s were engineered by these people to prefer people of the Nordic race, and that's the term they used. In the 30s, when Jews were trying to escape Germany, you could get out of Germany still in the 30s. You might not be able to take your property, but you could get out. If you could go get somewhere to let you in, they slammed shut the golden door. And they were utterly horrific, and they were closely linked with the Nazis. They held their Third International Congress of Eugenics in New York City in 1932, just as the Nazis were coming to power. They are elected as president of the International Eugenics Society, Dr. Ernst Rudin of the German Society for Racial Hygiene. He went on to be the Reich Commissar for Eugenics and wrote the race laws, making a criminal offense for Jews and Aryans to cohabitate. Here is what Rudin wrote in 1940 about his good friend Plotz, also from the German Society for Racial Hygiene. It is tragic that Plotz did not live to see the solution of the problem of understanding and cooperation of the Nordic races when he believed so ardently in the purposeful leadership of Adolf Hitler and his wholly national and international racial hygienic mission. But let it be a consolation to us that until his last breath, he maintained an unshakable hope of a victory of conquest of the German race. And in the then ensuing peace, there would follow a victory of racial hygiene. Okay, that's what these people were like, and it was only, frankly, the fact that Hitler turned against England that forced the upper class supporters of this, who were Anglophile, to break off their support for the eugenics movement and leave it adrift and basically force it to go underground during World War II. But the same people came out after the war and popped up pushing population control. The founding meeting of the Population Council in 1952 reads like a reunion of the pre-war eugenicists.
So, in terms of, just one thing that, these stories are so horrific, but what strikes me as so ominous is that these were all, as the global warming catastrophists would put it today, scientific consensuses, and that was such a major element of it, that it's just, well, science says that the gene pool is degrading, so we have to do something about it. And Hitler is doing something about it. And you have a scene in the book which is, I couldn't even believe it, about Americans hailing Hitler, American eugenicists going to Germany and hailing Hitler, and talking about him as a hero, Neville Chamberlain talking about him as a hero. And it only makes sense in the context of realizing that Nazism is based on a certain philosophy, and that particularly the left in America had a very similar core philosophy, particularly just the complete contempt ultimately for the individual human mind. I heard that thing about Polish Jews, and I was affected in particular because my grandfather, who was alive at that time, was a borderline genius, quote, defective Polish Jew who was a physicist at MIT. So, but this is they have so little regard for individuals, and yet, and to the point where they want to kill them. And this fundamentally wrong anti-mind, anti-individual philosophy manifests itself in all this pseudoscience garbage. And then we go to, as you say, we've got the whole population thing. Can you talk about that, the consequences of that, because that's even closer to the present?
Okay. Now, I do want to correct you on one thing. It's just, while this anti-human philosophy is mostly embraced by the left today, historically it has manifested both left-wing and right-wing customs as convenient to the time and place. For instance, both the Wilhelmine German militarism, which is unquestionably a right-wing movement, was very much derived its thinking from these postulates. Nazism, these pre-war eugenicists, most of them would consider themselves men of the right. Henry Fairfield Osborn, Madison Grant certainly consider themselves men of the right. There were some leftists. Herman Muller was a Stalinist. But it's really, they do a makeover in the 1960s of environmentalism, for example, which before the World War II was largely a cause of the right. It was ultra-right, in fact. It was largely the form of, oh, what beautiful country this would be if not for all these ugly little shacks. Stop the capitalists from using their insecticides. They're just trying to make money. We need to preserve nature against capitalism. So it gets reworked from left to right as convenient. And it has worked ultimately much better. It made the sale on the left, you might say, in our society for various reasons. But it's been both. But excuse me, I think I lost the track of the.
Oh no, that's fine. That's no problem. And I appreciate the correction. I should have said. It's because it's really a statist thing, and when you go left and right is ambiguous, especially when you're talking about Europe. But certainly the people who want to control our lives, this is in various ways is going toward. And I was just asking about the continuation of this toward population control, because that's something that's had very modern applications that people might not be aware of, and something that's very closely connected to the modern environmental movement.
Sure. Okay, so as I mentioned, starting in the late 40s and then taking a real takeoff in the early 50s with founding of the Population Council under the aegis of John D. Rockefeller and Frederick Osborn, the brother of Henry Fairfield Osborn, and Fairfield Osborn, his son, who also wrote the book Our Plundered Planet, which was a major launching point for post-war environmentalism in 1948. They set up the Population Council. Another fellow, Hugh Moore, launches the campaign to stop the population explosion. He's joined by a General Draper, who, by the way, was run out of post-war Germany by his fellow officers for apparent Nazis being soft on the Nazis, being an obstacle to the denazification program in Germany. They launched this program. Now, by the way, so now it's no longer polite to say, well, we have to get rid of these dark people because they're not Nordic. Instead, they say we got to get rid of these dark people because there's just too many of them. Now, there was both left-wing and right-wing rhetoric involved in this campaign. On the right, they during the Cold War, if you want to sell something to the government, you sell it that this will help stop communism. And so they did. They said, we have to suppress the population growth in the third world because these are the masses that will join the communist world revolution. And and on the left, it was, oh, we're so concerned about them because they're overpopulated. So in 1966, Draper et al. And Robert McNamara, who was a member of Draper's organization, the Population Crisis Committee, managed to engineer the putting through of legislation linking U.S. foreign aid to population control. And they and Paul Ehrlich, who by this point was on the scene, urged Johnson not to give foreign aid to India, which it desperately needed, not to give famine aid to India, unless they implemented forced sterilization programs. Now, this is very interesting because this was during the Vietnam War. And I think it was Joseph Califano, who was some functionary in the Johnson administration, went to Johnson and he said, look, Indira Gandhi's coming over here. She needs the aid. What we ought to do is link the aid to India swinging to our side in Vietnam. And Johnson blew him off. He said, no. Okay, we're going to link it to population control. Okay, we're not giving any aid. So far from helping us in the Cold War, this actually was an impediment to our success in the Cold War. But nevertheless, there were those who propagandized it on that basis. Certainly McNamara did, and recruited William Westmoreland, Ellsworth Bunker, and other Vietnam War personalities to campaign for population control. Anyway, so they did. Indira Gandhi capitulated, and they implemented forced sterilization programs in India, in which millions of women and men were rounded up and forcibly sterilized. Now, of course, in India, given that the Brahmins were running the show, the people they sterilized were the untouchables. When they started doing it to Muslims as well, they incited violent resistance, which they put down with military force. And then it became the basis of U.S. AID in scores of third world countries, making this a condition of our foreign aid. Indonesia, Peru, various African countries. And in every case, it's always the local elites directing the point of the population control at the people they despise.
You mentioned USAID. I mean, this whole thing where, and we really have to think about it. I mean, these are all individuals who have, just think about, you're not allowed to have a kid. I mean, or you're permanently forced to not have a kid because someone has this idea that it's impossible for the world to sustain a population of 4 billion people. You know, at back when it was, of course, that low. Now it, of course, can sustain way more. And one thing that struck me in all of this history is just how many of the organizations that are really murderers or torturers in this saga are still with us today and very prominent, including USAID.
Yeah. And in fact, this year, the United States will appropriate $950 million to fund population control programs.
Wow. Yeah, I don't know what to say about that. That's yeah, and it's
well,
it's
a
just
good place for Congress to start might be not appropriating that money.
yeah, it's so striking how you can just have this false idea that gets that the government declares to be scientific, and then that justifies coercive imposition, and then the population is complacent, and that really leads us to the modern environmental movement, which you discuss extensively in the book. And there's a lot more even beyond that to discuss, where they are really, they not only, I mean, they oppose nuclear power, which is much of the exciting future of power, and they oppose the only known present of power, which is, as you put it, fire. Can you talk about that opposition?
Sure. They want to ration fire. That's what cap and trade is, ration the right to use combustion. I mean, look, you know, in 1972, Club of Rome says we're going to run out of resources, we're going to run out of everything by 1990. Well, we didn't run out of anything by 1990. So now they're saying Well, we've run out of the right to use resources. The issue is not that we're running out of oil, although a few of them still say that, but it's that we've run out of the right to use it. And coal, which we're clearly not running out of. We've run out of the right to use that. We will ration the right to use it. So we will ration the right to use fire, just as they wanted to ration the right to use resources, or ration the right to people to have children, or ration the right of people to have food. Basically, it's about enhancing the power of the state to ration something. I mean, just imagine for a moment. Okay, in 1968, Ehrlich, in his book *The Population Bomb*, said not only should we force sterilization programs on the third world, we should set up a Bureau of Population for the United States, and if Americans want to have children, they should apply for permits to the federal government, and in this way we can restrict the number of children to the number that we want, and only from the right people. And now just imagine the enhancement of power of the federal government if that had actually become law. You would have to go petition the federal government for the right to have a child. And they'd look over your record and they'd say, you know, Alex, we appreciate that you'd like to have a kid, but we looked at your podcasts and you've expressed a lot of views that indicate to us that you might not be the right kind of person to raise a child. Why don't you come back to us in a year and we'll see how you develop between now and then? You know, I mean, the power to ration is the power to control. I mean, I think that one of the principal purposes of the one-child policy in China is not just to limit population, but to enhance the power of the state over the individual in every level of their private life. And yes, if you're a very good person, if you're an informer, perhaps we'll look the other way if you have a second child. Okay. On the other hand, if you're not somebody who really plays ball with us, you have a second child, we'll take that kid away from you and do away with it.
Yeah, and I mean, as is clear from the history, people are just all too willing to impose that kind of rule over someone else's life, and you know, again, populations with the wrong ideas are more than willing to let it happen. And what's so valuable about this kind of material is that it wakes us up and shows us parallels between atrocities that we recognize as atrocities in the past, and then things that we're perpetrating now and that are on the horizon. And the last one of those I want to talk about was one that I used to study pretty intensely on the philosophical side, but I hadn't kept up with, and that is biotechnology. And can you talk about just the amazing inspirational possibility with even just genetically modified foods, and the nihilistic opposition to that by the green movement?
Yeah. Look, except for wild caught fish, all the foods you eat are genetically modified. You know, the cattle, the chickens, the corn, you know, the apples, all these have been bred over centuries by people to make them much bigger, more nutritious, more tasty, what have you. However, with modern day genetics, we have been able to do breeding of new strains, not in the fairly blind and somewhat random way that people had to do before, but by looking directly at what are the qualities of certain plants that you actually want and cross them with another and create much more nutritious crops. So, for example, in the third world, okay, the diet of the poor around the world are cereals. This is what is the cheapest bulk food that there are. But these foods lack vitamins that you get from fruits, vegetables, and meats. And so the poor around the world suffer extensively from various vitamin deficiency diseases, one of which, for example, is vitamin A deficiency. Vitamin A is plentiful in carrots and somewhat in some other fruits and vegetables and even meat, but they don't get it. Well, we found a way to put the gene for producing beta-carotene, the thing that gives the carrot its orange color and its vitamin A, in rice, and they call it golden rice. And it grows just like any other rice, except it's rich in vitamin A, and anybody who eats it is not going to suffer from vitamin A deficiency. And Millions of people around the world go blind or die every year from vitamin A deficiency. This would end it. Yet the European Greens, whose flagship is the German Green Party, which incidentally was created by former Nazis who themselves had all kinds of food fetishes, um, they say, no, this is wrong. You shouldn't be allowed to do this. And to stop the third world countries from doing it, they've had the European Union pass legislation that allows it to ban the import of crops from countries that use genetically modified plants. And in other words, not just the imports of the genetically modified plants, but all imports from these countries. Now, these third world countries, they depend upon the income from agricultural exports to Europe. And so most of them can't cross the Europeans on this. And so they do not allow the use of golden rice and various others of these genetically modified crops that could greatly alleviate the distress of their people. And so this is an incredible operation where these European Greens, on the basis of their ideology or aesthetic considerations, if you will, are stopping the implementation of life-saving, health-saving crops across large swaths of the world. They're literally taking the vitamins out of the mouths of people in Africa and Asia who desperately need them.
Yeah, and this is the only thing I've heard of that's close to the level of their of evil in terms of, and I mean evil literally, of their opposition to energy and then their opposition to DDT, which we don't have time to get into now, but definitely when people read the book, read Robert's account of DDT. It's just an incredible achievement, and then there was just such a nihilistic destruction of it. So I'm curious, having written this book, which I think everyone should read, and which I think is just this tremendous historical resource and puts together everything so well in a way that I study this for a living, and I just learned a tremendous amount from it. What has been the general reaction that you've gotten from it?
Well, the book has actually only been published 3 weeks, and it's getting a pretty strong reaction. It's selling pretty well on Amazon and elsewhere. I've been invited on about 50 radio shows, and people are pretty struck by it. It is interesting, though, that in the radio shows, I've generally been getting a very strong response from conservatives, from Catholics, from pro-technology people. But there's a certain group of liberals who I got a very strange reaction from, and it was, I was actually shocked, which is that when I was discussing this population control stuff and about these forced sterilization programs, several liberal radio hosts would start denying it. They said, well, you have no proof of that. You have no proof that they're doing forced sterilization in Peru and India. I said, what are you talking about? This has been in all the press. I said, no, you have no proof. And I said, look, this is a Holocaust and you're denying it. And then suddenly it struck me that I was dealing with Holocaust deniers, literally Holocaust deniers, and not deniers of a historical Holocaust, which should not be denied, but one that is going on now and which could be averted by people taking action. And the blandness of this and the immorality of it, I was just floored.
Yeah, I don't know if this is one of the ones you're talking about, and you don't need to call out the host, but I just want to comment on one of the ones I heard with Brian Lehrer, who in New York, whom I've heard do other things and have respect for him as a host. But what struck me about him, and he's clearly a liberal, is that he really did not like the idea that today's green movement could have ideological similarities with the past, or indeed that any of its scientific claims could be tainted by ideology. And then if you point out something like, well, the genetically modified foods, I mean, it's scientifically proven that, quote, I mean, that we need to genetically engineer foods to live, that all of these things have been genetically engineered. There's no safety risk, that there's all benefit, that the risk is on the side of we're letting millions and millions of people die and get sick and blind. But people don't like the idea that their green ideology, which amounts to we should minimize our transformation of nature, they don't want to admit that that means death for people. And then when people actually act on it and people die, they don't want to see it. So they don't want to see that there's these population control. They don't want to know about the people who died for lack of DDT, the people who died for lack of golden rice. And what frustrates me is that it's uninteresting to them. They don't, and I hope that the better people who subscribe to this will see these examples and see the parallels and not deny them, not be able to ignore them, because it's very powerful.
Yeah, I mean, that's it. They simply do not want to see the consequences of their actions. They don't want to see what happens when you deny golden rice to people suffering from vitamin deficiencies. They don't want to see the misery of millions of people getting malaria because they deny them the pesticides that they need, and so forth. They just simply don't want to see it. And but the proof is there.
So the last question I'll ask is just about the concept that you chose to characterize this movement, which is anti-humanism, which has a lot of resonance with me. But I'm curious how you would connect that with something like communism, which is the most murderous movement of the 20th century and maybe of all time. And would you put them under anti-humanism, or what's the commonality among the anti-humanists that either includes or excludes the communists?
Well, there's a commonality in that they are both collectivist. And one metaphor that I find a constant refrain among these anti humanists is the idea of humans as a cell in some larger body, such as the race or the biosphere. Okay? And you find this metaphor used by Galton, the creator of eugenics. You find it among the Nazis. You find it the Club of Rome. You find it, it says the earth has cancer and the cancer is man. You find it with Ehrlich and Holdren, who use this repeatedly. You find it with the Gaia people, in the global warming movement. And the essence of this is, okay, if humans are just cells in this larger body, if they only exist for what they can do for the race, well, then they have no rights. They are expendable. And they can be cut out, just as, the Nazis always talking about, the Jews being a bacillus invading the body of the Volk, or Paul Ehrlich, a cancer is an uncontrolled multiplication of cell. The population explosion is an uncontrolled multiplication of people. Okay, we must shift our efforts to from the treatment to the cutting out of the cancer. Kill the infection, say the Nazis. Cut out the infection. Cut out the cancer, says Ehrlich. The earth has cancer. The cancer is man. We have this abortionist up in Boulder, so the human race is a malignancy upon the earth. And I think such metaphors are also endemic among communism as well. The difference is that, well, until recently anyway, communism was pro-technology. Historically, it was the shift of the so-called Marxist movement to embrace anti-technology nostrums to basically try to get gate receipts from the environmentalist movement is one that has made a bad movement worse, if that's possible. But yeah, to move it in the direction of something more like Pol Pot.
Yeah, I mean the collectivism. Any collectivist movement, I think, is going to be anti-human, and I think with the communists, it's really interesting because they, of course, they have many parallels in the term. They talk about scientific socialism. They have this whole mantle of science, and what they do is they appropriate the comforts of the products of capitalism and of individualism, namely technology. But of course, in practice, they're completely anti-technology because ultimately they're anti-individual, which means they're anti-mind, and that's how you get something like Lysenko controlling all of agriculture in Russia. So, but anyway, I was just curious about that from a philosophical perspective. Okay, well, we're almost out of the hour, but I want to give you a chance if there's anything else you think people need to know about the book, and then tell us where we can learn more about the book or what else we can do to promote it.
Okay, well, first of all, the fundamental point from the book is this, is we're not in danger of running out of resources. We're in danger from people who say we're running out of resources. We're not in danger from overpopulation. We're in danger from people who say that the world is overpopulated. You say the world is overpopulated, that's basically an incitement to genocide. The Germans were never in a problem because they didn't have enough Lebensraum. Their problem was they elected people into power who said they didn't have enough Lebensraum. And that's what this is. That our wealth doesn't come from the land. It comes from people. People are the source of all resources. People are the source of all wealth. Okay, people are not the enemy. It is those who say people are the enemy who are the enemy. And where can you get the book? Well, in many stores, and of course on Amazon.com and BarnesandNoble.com.
Any websites you want to recommend to people for your other work or for your publication?
Okay, well, for Merchants of Despair, there is a website, merchantsofdespair.com, where we also have, assembled various podcasts and radio shows and some TV interviews and so forth. People can look at there. I've also wrote an extract from the book called The Population Control Holocaust that was published in the New Atlantis, and which can also be accessed there to get people can read that and get a flavor of what the book is like.
All right, great. Well, I want to thank you for coming on the program, but most of all, just for putting together this incredible resource. And I know I've gotten quite a few people to buy it so far, and we'll get as many as we can. So, Robert, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Power Hour, because what you don't know about energy can kill you. Here's Alex Epstein.
Thanks again to Dr. Robert Zubrin for joining us. Definitely make sure to get a copy of his book at Amazon.com. Again, it's Merchants of Despair by Robert Zubrin. As I mentioned, this is a really philosophical book, and philosophy is my first area of expertise. So I want to talk a bit about this philosophy that he calls anti-humanism, both what I think is the positive antidote, and then hopefully shedding a little bit more light on what this view is and why people hold it. If we step back and look at what has made Western civilization so amazing, and when I say Western civilization is so amazing, that doesn't mean that every aspect of it has always been amazing. Far from it. I mean, the Nazis and the communists grew out of Western civilization. But it goes to what are the elements of it that led to the greatest parts of it, such as the United States of America, such as the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, technological revolution, industrial revolution, biotechnological revolution, computer revolution, widespread pursuit of happiness, more than doubling of the human life expectancy, et cetera, et cetera. And I think the two essentials are a belief in human reason and a belief in individualism. The belief in the power, and those go together. It's really about every individual's life matters. It belongs to him, and he has a mind that can intelligently figure out how to best benefit his life. And because his life belongs to him, he has a right to exercise his reason. And if we look at our Declaration of Independence, it's chock full of reason and individualism. It talks about the unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And what recognizing those two things did was just bring about the most amazing transformation in human history. I mean, we had almost stagnation for thousands and thousands of years, relatively speaking, and this incredible explosion of productivity. And the key to it was that individuals who had once been bound to some sort of collective or some sort of government were allowed to maximize their potential by creating as much as they possibly could in voluntary cooperation with others who were creating as much as they possibly could. And what became clear was that the individual human mind and the combination of individual human minds could lead us to a world of greater and greater progress. And of course, while there were bumps on the road, I would say mostly based on vestiges of collectivism and anti-reason and bad government policy, the direction was incredibly, incredibly good. And I think we have to look at the movements of population control, eugenics, and environmentalism in that context, in the context of life was getting better and better and better due to reason and individualism. And yet there was this mass, at least among intellectuals, this mass opposition uh, to these movements, which should be really disturbing. So if you take something like population control, we talked about a bit about during the show with Thomas Malthus. I mean, he's writing about how the earth can't sustain a certain population and therefore how coercive measures need to be taken. And he says things like, yeah, you shouldn't give charity, you shouldn't help alleviate people's suffering because it's a losing quest. He's saying that even though the evidence is starting to mount that human technology makes it possible to support an indefinitely large population, and certainly over the next century with the Industrial Revolution, that becomes completely clear, and yet people are opposing it. Or if you take something like eugenics, what this forced sterilization and then even forced extermination of certain races, what it's cashing in on is the fact that there are many, I think the objective fact that many people deny that not all cultures are equal, that many, there are many barbaric practices around the world, just for example, female genital mutilation in different parts of Africa. But what they do is instead of saying this group of people has not yet learned reason and individualism in a proper form of government, they ascribe it, of all things, to their race, which, if you know any history, is just the stupidest thing in the world because at different times, people with different colors of skin are either relatively the most rational people in the world or completely barbaric. So you have times when the Muslim world is, the most civilized part of the world, and times when it's the most uncivilized part of the world. And you can pretty much mix and match there. So if we look at the real developments in history, what's going on during the time of eugenics, which they're degrading as this decline in the gene pool, is actually overall an advance in reason and the availability of better ideas to people of all races, which brings out the fundamental truth about race, which people should know, which is that it's a non-essential characteristic because the fundamental thing uniting human beings is that we all have brains. And you can talk to anyone of any race who has any kind of education and perceive that fact. Now, you might not always agree with any given person, whatever their race's views, but it's just such a plain fact. So again, reason and individualism, where practiced, were leading to a great, a great advance in civilization. But what I would say, the anti-reason movement was still hanging on to this idea that human beings, not all race somehow defines human beings. And really this idea, it really amounts to the view which Ayn Rand described, that human beings are like stockyard animals, and that really what makes you good or not is your breeding. And in the book, Zubrin has this horrific quote from the oh so progressive New York Times. I believe it's from 1895, and they're talking about the death of Frederick Douglass, who was a brilliant um, former slave, who's obviously black. And in that article, instead of just recognizing this as a brilliant individual, they point to the fact that he has some mixed race in his heritage, which is very common among Black Americans. And they ascribe all the benefits and all the genius of him. I mean, I'm laughing because it's just so absurd, to the white part of him. And they say, well, he could have been an even greater genius if only he hadn't been so much black. I mean, this is just like a total bizarre reading of the situation, but it comes from not really valuing the human mind. So with population control, population, we've got this view that, well, human beings can't, they're stupid. They can't figure out how to have children responsibly. They can't figure out how to sustain those children if they have them. But all the free societies prove that they could. And the race thing is human beings don't really have minds. They just have different degrees of animal breeding, and so we should get the best how can we allow the bad ones to breed? But in reality, human beings have minds, and the only quote breeding decision should be made by free individuals pursuing their own happiness. And with environmentalism, you get the same denigration of reason and individualism. What they're saying is that your life does not belong to you. It really belongs to nature, and in part because you're so stupid and short range that when you use a plastic bag or what have you, it's quote destroying the planet in this unprovable way. And the whole history of environmentalism is just this series of scares and scams, um, that are all quote scientific, which as were population control and eugenics, showing that ultimately leaving individuals free to use their minds is wrong. Um, and this is really this common thread. And so what needs to be instilled above all to combat these kinds of movements is a reverence for the individual and the power of reason. And if you realize that, you realize that no matter what kind of problem comes up, the solution is going to be more individualism in technology. Even if there was a real problem with a near catastrophic global warming, the solution would be some form of technological free solution. It would not be a bunch of dictators, telling us how to live our lives, and it certainly wouldn't be any kind of assault on the idea of transforming the planet. Which that whole opposition to having an impact, the thing that they oppose the impact of is human beings, which means ultimately it's the human mind. The human mind is choosing how to change the world around them, and they are ultimately against the human mind. The last thing I want to say about this whole set of philosophical ideas is I think giving credit where credit is due. And I think more than anyone in the world, Ayn Rand has been done a complete injustice on this issue, and is the hero that we should study on these questions. If you just go to AynRandLexicon.com, and if you look up the left, she'll talk about the new left, which is this modern environmental version of the left. Or if you look up the issue of mind and all the anti-mind movements she talks about, this is someone who in the 40s, 50s, and 60s is identifying that all these quote scientific movements are really ultimately anti-scientific, anti-reason, are going to lead to disaster in practice. And she is completely denounced for it. She's called simplistic, she's called stupid. And all these people are the people who were in favor of this. And if you read Merchants of Despair, you'll see these organizations who were in favor of eugenics, who were in favor of population control, organizations like Sierra Club, World Wildlife Fund. These people these people are held in high esteem, and Ayn Rand is regarded as some sort of like intellectual primitive. And yet, if you read her work, especially read Merchants of Despair, then read, The End of Atlas Shrugged, or read the book The New Left or Return of the Primitive, you'll just see how dead on she is, which should be intellectually very illuminating, but I think also should really make you appreciate how much of a hero it is, and how much of a hero she is, and how much of a hero people who respect reason and individualism are throughout history, because they have been opposed furiously, been called all kinds of names, and yet the few people who stood up are the reason why, they did as much as possible to minimize the atrocities and to make possible the amazing things we have today, even though they were completely mistreated by the culture. So hopefully going forward, we'll have a culture with more reason, more individualism, that treats those who stand up for those ideas not with contempt and scorn, but treats with contempt and scorn those who deny and oppose the glory that is the individual human mind. So that was a bit of a monologue there, but this book I think is incredibly important, and I think it's incredibly important to really understand as deeply as possible what's going on with these movements, how they work, what makes them possible, so that we can minimize their impact and so that we can replace them with alternatives such as what I call the industrial progress movement, as well as pro-reason, pro-individualism movements in other fields. Now, last thing, I mentioned there would be an announcement, so here it is. If you, the audience, want it, we're going to start doing Power Hour weekly. Hopefully that excites you. It excites me for a couple reasons. One, recently, I know people have liked the show and benefited from it, but recently I've been talking with a lot of people, including in various energy industries, even students, writers, and I've time after time, people have told me, of all the things you do, Power Hour, that's the one I listen to. That's the one I learn the most from. One experience I had was uh, recently when working with some new writers we have at Center for Industrial Progress who are writing blogs, writing articles for mainstream publications. These are mostly people from industry who are using their industry knowledge along with our philosophical knowledge and writing some really, really neat articles. And I was really impressed by what they were submitting, how high quality it is, because it's very hard to write, to learn how to write, to learn how to think, and to organize ideas. And when I asked them about this, many of them said that listening to Power Hour, hearing about all the facts from the guests, and also hearing about the CIP way of thinking about things and the philosophy behind it was really helpful to them. So if we can help new thinkers in the industry, I mean, to me, that is definitely worth doing as much as possible. And then also, I mentioned industry. People in industry are starting to listen to that podcast, and that's something I want to promote a lot more. And the more we can get that, I mean, I think that would be amazing because for people to be armed with facts, not only about their industry, but about the other industry, and then to be armed with the philosophy about how to defend themselves is super powerful. I think weekly is really the ideal way to do this. Also, in relation to guests, since the beginning of the show, when we knew relatively few people, now we have access to literally dozens and dozens of super smart people that I'll meet on the internet, at conferences, etc. I mean, this month we had Robert Zubrin, which is fantastic. Last month we had Pierre de Rocher, who got tremendous response, and deservedly so, because the guy is a human encyclopedia on all things energy, industry, environmental history, etc. He's expressed interest in coming on the show again. There are people just from industry, from academia, from think tanks, and and they've got so much valuable information that, again, when combined with the philosophical perspective of the show, I think makes for a unique experience. There are also just so many important topics to cover. We've covered so many things. We haven't even had a show on coal. We haven't had a show on fracking. We haven't had a show on environmental legislation. Having a weekly show will allow us to deal with all those issues, and also to deal with the issues that are most current. It can be a much more current show while still retaining that higher level perspective. And as far as your own experience goes, I think there are two benefits. One is you're going to get a lot more knowledge if the show is weekly. And at the same time, what's going to happen is we're going to build a library of audio go-to resources that you can share with your friends. And whenever they have a question about any of these kinds of issues, you'll have a really good place to go to where they can get experts breaking down the issues from the right perspective in really, really clear language. We'll also start excerpting the shows in smaller bites so that people who don't want to listen to a whole hour can listen to a really important 5-minute section. One more thing we can do, given 4 or 5 episodes a month, is bring on more people who disagree and have debate formats occasionally, which I think is will be really fun and really educational. I've done a lot of debates on college campuses. I know those are the things that get the best response on YouTube, or sometimes if I debate Occupy Wall Street or Greenpeace. But really, the most constructive debates are going to be with real experts from the other side, and that's definitely something we'll do if we do a weekly show. So I think this is a no-brainer. I hope you think it sounds good. And if you want this kind of information weekly, here's what I'm going to ask of you. This is going to take us a certain amount of resources, but it's not going to take that much. If you just donate $9 a month, that's about $2 an episode. If 50 of you do that, that'll cover our baseline costs. If 100 of you do that, that'll enable us to really market this everywhere around the internet, promote it in all kinds of different places, and I think really make this the leading free market energy show on the web. So if this sounds exciting to you, here's what I need you to do. Go to our website, www.industrialprogress.net. That's www.industrialprogress.net. There's a big button at the top that says donate. click on that, scroll down, and you'll see one of the payment options is $9 a month. It's really easy to pay. You can pay by credit card, you can pay by PayPal, you can even pay by check if you scroll down the page. But anyway, click on that and complete the checkout. Now, there are also higher payment options. If you want to click on those, that's fantastic. But the main thing is we just need a bunch of people who love the show to just give $9 a month. That'll totally take care of it. That'll make possible all of these things. If you run into any problems, have any questions, email me, email CIP at support@industrialprogress.net. That's support@industrialprogress.net. We'll get back to you. Now, just to be clear, what happens if we don't raise enough money, we don't go weekly? Well, I believe in you guys. I believe in listeners of the show. I think you, from what you've told me, you get real value from this, and you know that others get value from it. So I think this is an opportunity you won't want to pass up. But worst case scenario, I will absolutely refund your money if we don't raise enough by June 1st. So that's the deadline, June 1st. If you want 50 episodes of Power Hour a year instead of 12, if you want all the different kinds of episodes I talked about, professionally produced, if you want to take this show's reach and influence to the next level, again, go to industrialprogress.net, click donate, and contribute $9 a month. That's 3 cups of coffee a month. I know this is, to at least a lot of you, it's worth that much. And with that, now that you've gone and done that, hopefully, it's time to wrap up the Power Hour. I hope you learned something, and if you did and think it's important information, please tell your friends and colleagues about it whatever way you can. Facebook, Twitter, email, phone calls, smoke signals, anything short of spam. As always, if you have any questions, comments, hate mail, or love mail, you can send it to me at alex@alexepstein.com. And to subscribe to this podcast or subscribe to the monthly newsletter with even more energy goodness, go to www.industrialprogress.net, which has all the links you need. Make sure while you're there to check out all our new blog posts by the new and growing array of talented writers Center for Industrial Progress is bringing on board. We'll be back in June, starting, I think, our new weekly format. So until then, I'm Alex Epstein, and this has been Power Hour.
Power Hour is a TJ DeSantis production. Its content is intended for private use only.